In 1948, one factory in Elizabeth, South Australia, changed what it meant to be Australian. Walk into any driveway from Cairns to Fremantle, and there was a better than even chance you would see that badge on the bonnet. The Lion. Holden. They built the 48-215 that gave a war-weary nation something to be proud of. They invented the Monaro that made grown men pull over and stare. They built the Commodore that won Bathurst so many times the trophy cabinet ran out of room. At their peak, this company controlled nearly half of every car sold in Australia. Half. 1 in every 2 Australians buying a new car was buying a Holden. The factories ran 3 shifts. The workers were loyal. The waiting lists stretched for months. Cars so coveted that dealers allocated them like rations. Then something went catastrophically wrong. By 2013, those same factory floors were operating on borrowed time. The workers knew it. The managers knew it. The union delegates knew it. And on October 20, 2017, the last car rolled off the Elizabeth production line and the machines went silent forever. An empire that survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, the fuel crisis of 1974, and the Japanese import invasion was finally finished. Market share that once touched 48% had collapsed to single digits. Billions of dollars in government subsidies had bought nothing but delays. 3,000 workers on the floor that day walked out of the gates for the last time. This is the story of how a leather goods merchant from Adelaide accidentally built Australia's greatest industrial dynasty. How one handshake with an American giant transformed a saddlery business into a car company that defined a nation. How that car company made a series of decisions so cautious, so dependent on government protection, and so blind to the world changing around it, that it could not survive the moment the protection ended. This is not just about old Commodores rusting in your uncle's paddock. This is about the fatal cost of comfort. The danger of believing your government will always save you. And what happens when a nation's pride in a name blinds everyone, the company, the politicians, the public, to the slow disaster unfolding in plain sight. Welcome inside the silent Holden factory, where Australia's car empire was built, celebrated, and lost. James Alexander Holden arrived in Adelaide from England in 1852 with a leather worker's trade and almost nothing else. He opened a small saddlery on Rundle Street and spent the next 3 decades building a reputation so solid it became the foundation of everything that followed. Every saddle stitched tight. Every harness made to last. By the time his grandson Edward Wewall Holden inherited the business in the early 20th century, Holden was the most trusted leather goods name in South Australia. But horses were dying. Edward watched the motor car arrive and understood immediately what it meant for a saddlery business. He did not panic. He did not deny it. He pivoted. Leather workers who spent careers making harnesses learned to trim car interiors. Upholsterers who stitched saddlebags now stitched seat cushions. The skills transferred. The discipline transferred. The obsession with quality transferred. By the early 1920s, Holden's Motor Bodybuilders was fitting 14,000 car bodies a year for British and American manufacturers shipping chassis to Australia. Then in 1926, General Motors came calling. The arrangement made sense for both sides. General Motors needed local manufacturing to satisfy Australian import tariffs. Holden needed the volume and investment that only a global giant could provide. In 1931, General Motors acquired Holden outright. Full ownership. The name stayed Australian. The money and the decisions were now American. This moment matters more than anyone acknowledged at the time. Because the day Holden became a General Motors subsidiary was the day its ultimate fate was tied to decisions made in boardrooms in Detroit by people who had never driven down the Hume Highway or watched a sunset over the Nullarbor. Nobody thought about that in 1931. They were thinking about survival. The Great Depression was consuming the world. Factories were closing everywhere. Workers were being laid off by the millions. General Motors' money was not a compromise. It was a lifeline. Through the 1930s and into the war years, the partnership functioned. Holden built bodies. GM supplied mechanical components. Cars came out the other side. The Elizabeth plant in South Australia expanded. The workforce grew. Skills accumulated. The industrial base deepened. But something was missing. The cars Holden assembled carried American and British DNA. There was no Australian car. Not really. Just local assembly of foreign designs. And after 6 years of war, after sacrifice on a scale the country had never experienced, after soldiers came home to a nation that needed something to believe in, the absence of an Australian car felt like an insult. Ben Chiefeley's Labour government felt it too. Australia needed its own car. Built here. Designed here. For Australian conditions. Australian roads. Australian families. Not an import with local upholstery. A real car. An Australian car. General Motors Holden got the contract. On November 29, 1948, the 48-215 rolled off the Elizabeth production line. Prime Minister Chifley was there. The cameras were there. The country was watching. And when Chifley walked around that first car and said it was a beauty, he was not reviewing a vehicle. He was acknowledging a national moment. Australia had built its own car. Not imported it, not assembled a foreign kit, built it. From concept to production. Australian engineers. Australian workers. Australian steel. The marketing campaign captured it perfectly. Australia's own car. 3 words that meant something in 1948 in a way they are almost impossible to explain today. The country had spent 6 years being told what it could not do, what it did not have, what it depended on others for. And now here was proof of what Australian hands and Australian minds could produce when given the chance. The public went berserk for it. Waiting lists formed immediately. Dealers were besieged. The 48-215 was not a perfect car. The engine was small, the interior was basic, the performance was modest. It did not matter. Australians were not buying a car. They were buying a statement. They were buying the idea that this country could make things the world respected. By the mid-1950s, Holden controlled 48% of the Australian new car market. Nearly half. 1 in every 2 cars sold was a Holden. The Elizabeth factory was running at full capacity. Thousands of workers on the floor. Hundreds of suppliers feeding the production line. Entire communities built around the work the factory provided. South Australia in particular became Holden country. The Elizabeth plant was not just an employer. It was the employer. Fathers brought sons into the factory. Brothers worked the same line. Whole suburbs existed because Holden existed. The plant was not separate from the community around it. It was the community around it. And then Ford arrived with serious intent, and the greatest rivalry in Australian sporting history began. Ford had been selling cars in Australia since the 1920s but had never truly threatened Holden's dominance. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Ford Australia was ready to fight properly. The XK Falcon launched in 1960. Lighter, simpler, competitive on price. And suddenly the conversation Australian men were having in pubs and driveways and at the football changed. Not just what car are you driving. Which side are you on? Holden versus Ford became something that transcended cars. It was identity. It was tribal loyalty that passed from parent to child the way religion or football teams did. You were a Holden family or a Ford family. You did not switch. Switching was a kind of betrayal. It required explanation. It generated genuine family conflict. Australians argued about these cars with a passion they rarely brought to politics or philosophy. The factories fed off this rivalry. Every time Ford released a new Falcon, Holden engineers worked harder on the next Commodore. Every time Holden won Bathurst, Ford redoubled its effort for the following year. The competition made both cars better. It made both companies more innovative. It gave Australian motorsport something to anchor itself to that went far beyond the racing itself. Bathurst became the annual referendum. The Hardy-Ferodo 500, later the Bathurst 1000, was not just a race. It was the verdict. Holden won more than Ford across the decades, but Ford won enough to keep the argument alive and burning. Every October the country split in two, and for a weekend the result on Mount Panorama mattered as much as anything in the national conversation. The 1960s were Holden at its most creative. The A Holden launched in 1963 and sold 70,000 units in the first few weeks. That number is staggering even today. 70,000 cars. In a country of 11 million people. In a few weeks. It remains one of the most successful car launches in Australian history. The A was followed by the HR, the HK, each iteration refining the formula. Each one selling in numbers that seemed impossible. And then in 1968, Holden did something that transcended transportation entirely. The Monaro arrived. 2 doors. Long bonnet. Short boot. A V8 engine that made a sound Australian men had never heard from, something with a Holden badge. The Monaro was not a family car with sporting pretensions. It was a genuine muscle car. It was beautiful in the way that machines are occasionally beautiful, when the function and the form align so perfectly that the result looks inevitable. The country lost its mind. Young men saved for years for a Monaro. Others took finance they could barely afford. The car appeared at every major cruise strip in every major city. It was driven by men who wanted to be seen and looked at by men who wanted what they were seeing. It became a symbol of Australian masculinity and aspiration in a way that no marketing department could have engineered because it was not engineered. It emerged. The car simply was what it was and people responded to it with a depth of feeling that surprised even Holden. The GTS 327 and the later 350 cubic inch variants were capable of performance that put them alongside American muscle cars that cost twice the price. Holden had built a world-class performance vehicle. In Australia. For Australians. At a price ordinary working men could stretch to reach. The Monaro sold until 1977. When it was discontinued, the public reaction was genuinely angry. Letters to newspapers. Petitions. Dealer complaints. People felt something had been taken from them. Not just a car. A piece of national identity. A proof of what Australia could produce when it tried. That anger was a signal Holden should have heard more carefully. The public was not just loyal to the company. They were emotionally invested in it in a way that went beyond rational consumer behavior. That investment was an asset worth more than any factory or any balance sheet entry. It was the kind of brand equity that takes generations to build and can be destroyed in years. Holden did not hear the signal clearly enough. They were too busy managing the next product cycle. Too busy negotiating with Detroit. Too busy dealing with a problem that was about to hit them from a direction they had not taken seriously. Japan. The oil crisis of 1974 arrived without warning and changed everything permanently. OPEC cut production. Petrol prices quadrupled almost overnight. The cars that Australians were driving, the big six-cylinders, the V8 Monaros, the heavy family sedans, suddenly felt like liabilities. The cost of filling a tank went from manageable to genuinely painful for working families. And into this chaos, with perfect timing that felt almost deliberate, came the Japanese. Toyota. Datsun. Mitsubishi. Mazda. Small cars. Light cars. Fuel-efficient cars. Cars that cost less to buy and a fraction of the price to run. Cars that started every time, never broke down, and required almost no maintenance compared to what Australian drivers were used to. The Japanese had spent 2 decades perfecting manufacturing processes that produced remarkable consistency. The quality was not just good. It was almost eerily reliable. Australian consumers noticed immediately. Holden's response was slow and inadequate. They had spent 25 years making big cars for a market that wanted big cars, and the adjustment required to make small cars properly was not just a design challenge. It was a manufacturing challenge, a supply chain challenge, an engineering culture challenge. The skills and the facilities that produced the Monaro were not easily redirected to produce something that competed with a Corolla. They tried. The Gemini arrived as their small car answer. It was a rebadged Isuzu. Not designed in Australia. Not engineered in Australia. Sourced from a Japanese manufacturer and given a local badge. Australians saw through it immediately. This was not Australia's own car. This was a Japanese car with a Holden sticker. The emotional connection that drove Holden's dominance did not transfer to a badge job. Meanwhile, Ford was struggling with the same problem. Both companies went to the federal government with their hands out, and the government, terrified of what the loss of the automotive industry would mean for employment and for the industrial base of the country, gave them what they asked for. Tariff protection. Import restrictions. Quotas on Japanese vehicles. The government built a wall around Australian car manufacturing and told the local industry that it was safe inside the wall. Keep building. Keep employing. We will keep the imports from eating you alive. This is where the story turns. This is the moment that feels like salvation but is actually the beginning of the end. When you protect an industry from competition, you protect it from the pressure that drives improvement. Every year that Holden operated behind tariff walls was a year in which the urgency to compete globally was reduced. Every year that import restrictions kept cheap Japanese and Korean cars at bay was a year in which Holden's management could look at the sales figures, see acceptable numbers, and tell themselves the strategy was working. It was not working. It was postponing a reckoning that was becoming larger and more inevitable with every year of delay. Through the 1980s, the protection continued. Labour governments and Liberal governments alike were terrified of the political cost of allowing Australian car manufacturing to contract. The factories were in marginal electorates. The workers were union members. The supply chain employed tens of thousands of people in communities that had no alternative employer of any comparable scale. Every politician who looked at the industry saw a problem they could not afford to own. So they kept writing checks. Industry assistance packages. Investment subsidies. Tariff protection maintained at levels that bore no relationship to what Australian manufacturers could actually achieve on price and quality in a genuine open market. Holden and Ford accepted the money gratefully, made promises about investment and employment, and largely continued doing what they had always done. The product improved. The Commodore that replaced the Kingswood range in 1978 was a genuinely competitive car. The VK, the VL, the VN series through the 1980s and early 1990s were well-engineered vehicles that Australians responded to with real enthusiasm. The Bathurst connection kept the brand alive and vital in a way that pure sales numbers could not capture. A Commodore that won Bathurst was a car that meant something. And Holden kept winning. But underneath the trophies and the brand loyalty, the economics were deteriorating in ways that the subsidies were concealing rather than solving. The Australian market was too small. 12 million people, 15 million, 18 million as the decades passed. A car industry needs volume to justify the investment in engineering and tooling. You cannot spread the cost of developing a new vehicle platform across 300,000 units a year and compete on price with manufacturers who sell the same platform to 20 million customers across 30 countries. The numbers simply do not work. General Motors understood this. The global restructuring that followed the 2008 financial crisis made it undeniable. GM went bankrupt in 2009, accepted a U.S. government bailout, and emerged with a mandate to cut costs and eliminate operations that could not justify themselves on financial grounds. Every subsidiary around the world was examined. The question was not whether the subsidiary had heritage or history or national significance. The question was whether it made money or could be made to make money with a realistic investment. Holden's answer was no. The Australian dollar had strengthened significantly through the 2000s. A strong dollar means that the cost of manufacturing in Australia, measured in US dollars, rises without anything about the factory changing. Workers earn the same in Australian dollars, but the US dollar cost of their wages increases. Components purchased locally cost more in global terms. The finished vehicles cost more to produce in global terms. And the competition from Asian manufacturers who pay their workers a fraction of Australian wages does not go away. By the early 2010s, Holden needed roughly $2,000 in government assistance for every car it produced just to remain marginally viable. $2,000 per car. Not capital investment in a future platform. Not development funding for a breakthrough technology. Just $2,000 to cover the gap between what it cost to build a car in Elizabeth and what the market would pay for it. The industry came to Canberra with its hand out one more time in 2013. Joe Hockey, the federal treasurer, said no. The decision was not made callously or without an understanding of the consequences. The economic reality was stark. The assistance being requested was not going to transform Holden into a competitive global manufacturer. It was going to keep the factories running for a few more years before the same conversation happened again. The government decided that years of further subsidy leading to the same inevitable conclusion was not a better outcome than ending it clearly. On December 11, 2013, General Motors Holden announced that it would cease manufacturing in Australia by 2017. The Elizabeth plant in South Australia. The Fisherman's Bend facility in Victoria. Both closing. All manufacturing ending. The reaction was extraordinary and entirely predictable. Australians who had not thought about Holden seriously in years suddenly discovered a grief that surprised them. Men who drove Japanese and Korean and European cars posted on social media about what Holden meant to their fathers. Politicians who had voted for free trade agreements that made Holden's position impossible gave speeches about the tragedy of the closure. The grieving was genuine. But it arrived approximately 30 years too late to be useful. The 4 years between the announcement and the closure were both agonizing and oddly peaceful. The workers knew the date. The managers knew the date. Every car that rolled off the line from December 2013 to October 2017 was built by people who knew they were building their way toward their own unemployment. The quality of those final cars, by all accounts, was as high as anything Holden had ever produced. The workers on that floor were not going to let the last chapter be a shoddy one. The final Commodore was a VF Series 2 SS in slipstream blue. The last shift worked through the night of October 19 and into the morning of October 20, 2017. The car was driven off the line by a worker named Mark Trotter who had spent years on that floor. There were tears on the line. Not performative tears. The kind that come from understanding that something real has ended. 3,000 people worked directly at the Elizabeth plant. 40,000 more worked in the supply chain that fed it. Component manufacturers, material suppliers, logistics companies, toolmakers, the entire ecosystem of the Australian automotive industry had been built around Holden and Ford and Toyota all manufacturing simultaneously. When all three ended within months of each other, the ecosystem collapsed entirely. There was no partial adaptation. The supply chain cannot survive at partial volume. It either works as a complete system or it does not work at all. Some workers found other employment. Many did not. Tradespeople in their 50s with 30 years of highly specific automotive manufacturing skills discovered that those skills did not translate easily to a labor market that had no automotive manufacturing left. The communities around Elizabeth did not recover quickly. They are still recovering. The Holden brand itself staggered on in name only. Imported vehicles from South Korea and elsewhere carried the badge. A Holden Equinox. A Holden Acadia. Cars with no Australian content, no Australian engineering, no Australian workers in their production. Just the badge. Just the lion. Just the name above the door of dealerships that were now selling Korean crossovers wearing Australian nostalgia as a costume. In February 2020, General Motors announced that Holden would be discontinued entirely. Even the badge would go. The dealerships would close. The name that James Alexander Holden put on a Rundle Street leather shop in 1856 would be retired permanently. The reaction was grief again. But quieter this time. More resigned. The closure of the factory in 2017 had been the real death. The 2020 announcement was just the funeral. Today if you drive out to Elizabeth in South Australia and find the site of the old plant, you will see what comes after an empire ends. Demolition has been underway. The factory that built Australia's own car, that employed 3,000 people, that anchored a community for 7 decades, is being cleared. Some sections remain as of this writing. The bones of the building. The footprint of the production floor. But the machines are gone. The workers are gone. The cars are gone. It is quiet in a way that industrial sites should not be quiet. And standing there, in that quiet, 3 lessons become unavoidable. The first is about protection and what it costs you. Tariff walls and government subsidies kept Holden alive for decades past the point where the economics demanded radical change. That protection felt like kindness. It felt like the government and the industry working together for the national good. But what it actually did was insulate Holden from the competitive pressure that forces innovation. Every year behind the tariff wall was a year the company did not have to solve the problem of how to build cars that the world wanted at prices the world would pay. When the wall came down, the problem had not gone away. It had grown larger and harder and more expensive to solve. The protection did not save Australian car manufacturing. It delayed its reckoning while making the reckoning more catastrophic when it finally arrived. The second lesson is about scale and the lies we tell ourselves about it. The Australian market was always too small to support a full-scale domestic car industry at global competitive costs. This was true in 1978 when the Commodore launched. It was true in 1988 when the government was writing assistance checks. It was true in 2003 when the dollar was rising. Everyone in the industry knew it. Everyone in government knew it. The reports were written. The consultants were paid. The analysis was done and the analysis always said the same thing. At some point, a reckoning is coming. The response was always to fund another few years of delay and hope that something changed. Nothing changed. What Australia needed was not a strategy to keep the existing industry alive indefinitely. What it needed was a strategy to transition the skills and the workers and the industrial capacity into sectors where the economics actually worked. That strategy never arrived because the political cost of announcing it was higher than any government was willing to pay. The third lesson is about what a brand is worth and how easily that worth can be destroyed. Holden had something in 1968, in 1978, in 1988, that money could not buy. The emotional connection between ordinary Australians and that lion badge was as deep as any brand relationship anywhere in the world. People were not just buying cars. They were expressing identity. They were participating in something that felt Australian in the way the beach and the bush and the barbecue felt Australian. That connection was not manufactured by advertising. It was earned over decades by producing cars that were genuinely good, genuinely Australian, genuinely woven into the fabric of national life. And it was thrown away. Not deliberately. Not maliciously. But thrown away nonetheless. By the time Holden was selling imported Korean cars with Australian badges, the connection was already severing. Australians are not sentimental fools. They understood that a Holden Equinox built in South Korea by Korean workers had nothing to do with the Elizabeth factory or the workers who built the Monaro or the engineers who developed the Commodore. The badge was there. The meaning was gone. When General Motors finally retired the name in 2020, the grief was muted because the grief had already been done. The real Holden ended in October 2017 when the last worker turned off the last machine and walked out of the Elizabeth factory into a world where Australia did not make cars anymore. 161 years from James Alexander Holden stitching leather on Rundle Street to the Lion badge being retired forever. From a saddlery to a car empire to a name on imported Korean crossovers to nothing. The full arc. Ignat Schwinn came to America from Germany with a toolbox and built a dynasty. James Holden came to Australia from England with a leather workers' trade and did the same. The end of both stories rhymes in a way that should make everyone uncomfortable. Because the warning in the silence of the Elizabeth factory is not specific to car manufacturing. It is not specific to Australia. It is the same warning that echoes from every abandoned industrial site on every continent where an empire once operated. Adapt to the world as it is, not as it was. Build things people want at prices they can pay. Do not confuse your name for your value. Do not confuse government protection for competitive strength. Do not confuse the loyalty your customers feel for a guarantee that the loyalty will last forever regardless of what you do. Holden had all of it. The name. The loyalty. The heritage. The workers. The industrial capability. And it was not enough because having all of it is not the same as using all of it wisely. The factory is quiet now. Tell me in the comments where you were when you heard Holden was closing. Tell me what your first car was and whether it had a lion on the bonnet. Tell me if you stood at a dealership in 2017 and felt something that surprised you with its weight. I read every single one. Next time I am going to take you inside the story of the Ford Falcon. The other half of the greatest rivalry in Australian motoring history. How Ford fought Holden for 50 years, how the Falcon became just as embedded in national identity as the Commodore, and how Ford's closure ran parallel to Holden's in ways that feel less like coincidence and more like the inevitable end of an entire era of Australian industrial life. The Falcon story is different from the Holden story in the details and identical to it in the conclusion. Which makes it, if anything, even more devastating. Stay with me.